Plain than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. My heart has no desire to stay where doubts arise and fears dismay. Though some may dwell where these abound, my prayer, my aim is higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand by faith on heaven's stable land, a higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. I want to live above the world, though Satan's darts at me are hurled. For faith has called the joyful sound, the song of saints on higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand by faith on heaven's stable land, a higher plane than I have found. Yes, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. I want to scale the utmost height and catch a gleam of glory bright. But still I'll pray till heaven I found. Lord, lead me on to higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand by faith on heaven's stable land, a higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground.
Well, if we sang all those songs that slow, we'd never get to higher ground. I tell you what. It's like, come on, we'll get there. I know we will. Oh, yeah. One or the other, right?
Steve did it.
Well, I'm glad to be here tonight, and I'm glad you're here tonight. And I'm glad for higher ground, too.
Amen.
I hope that's where you're living right now, above everything else that's not mixed up in all the muck and the mire and everything else that's going on. Just showing the world there's something different going on. And anyhow, what do you all have to pray about tonight? Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. We will. What else? I saw a hand up here. Ann? Oh, wow. Okay. Ann said that there's a guy that she works with that Jason found out this week. He's 43. Found out he has stage 4 cancer in his stomach. It's already spread to his liver. So if you know anything about cancer, that's not what you want to hear. So let's be praying for Jason. What else tonight? I do want to give you an update on. I've been asking prayer for a little girl named Stella. She's 8 years old. My mom's good friend Donnell is Stella's grandmother. And anyhow, she needs brain surgery, and I don't know all the specifics of everything, but she had one lesser surgery. I believe it was yesterday or earlier today, and I don't know if they exactly know how well that went. It's kind of like wait and see, but I think almost for sure she's going to have a second one real soon here. So keep praying for her. Her name is Stella. So be praying for her. What else tonight? Harold? Yep. Yep. Absolutely. He'll be praying about that. I hope we all have, hopefully we all have somebody like that we're working on, we've got on our minds, we're praying for. Just, anyhow, be looking for somebody. You should be praying for somebody to get saved if you aren't. Yes. Sorry. Okay. Doug McLean. Okay. We'll be praying for him.
I got two praise reports. Dad, they got his heart shot back into rhythm yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
Purchased him, and said he felt like rested good, able to walk around, not staggering like a drunk man. He's done real well. Also, Pastor Leon Madison, Beaufort, South Carolina, we prayed for him several. Well, it's been a long time ago, several, less than a year, but about Anyway, he called me back today and said that he's got back from the doctor and cancer free. Amen.
Praise the Lord.
Let's give God the praise along with him. Amen.
Amen. That's wonderful news. To add to that, I asked prayer. Might have been last week or maybe the past couple weeks. So Dan and Stephanie, Courtney's parents, they go to a church in Charlotte, and their pastor found out a couple weeks ago, all within 1 week, that his father, that is in a nursing home, has the coronavirus. Then his mom has the coronavirus, and he has cancer. All in 1 week, he found out all that. But good news is his mother is recovered, and he had surgery, and they got all of the cancer. So he's good to go, apart from he still has to have some treatments to, I guess, double check and make sure. But anyhow, praise God for that. Keep praying for his father. He's still, I don't think he's even breathing on his own right now, with already being in a nursing home and then getting the coronavirus. And so, what else?
Pray for my grandma, Catherine.
Yep.
They found a spot on her ear, and she's going to have more tests done on it. And also, she was in a minor car accident earlier today.
Oh, really?
She's okay.
Okay. All right. So we need to pray for Catherine. I don't know if you could hear Gage. She was in a minor car accident earlier today, and she's doing fine, he said. But be praying for her. And they found that there's a spot on her ear, and they're doing some more testing on that to find out exactly what that is. So be praying for that. Anything else? Yes. Okay, absolutely. We will. We will. Is there anything else tonight? Wow. Okay. Maybe something could be done about that. Yes, go ahead, Lisa. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Anything else tonight? All right. If there's not anything else, then let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear God, we come into your presence, and Lord, it's just a comfort to be here and to know that you are the Lord, and that these situations are not situations that you are unaware of. But Lord, we know that you want us to ask. You're our Father, and you want us to speak with you, and speaking with you matters. And Lord, I ask you to, there's so many requests, especially all the people who are struggling physically with cancer or whatever else it might be, Father. Lord, I pray that more than anything, your will would be done in all those situations. But Lord, I pray that if there's anyone in a situation like that that is not saved, Lord, I pray that you would just show them the peace that could be theirs if they were to place their trust in you. And Lord, I pray for the Christians that are going through deep waters right now, going through difficult circumstances. I pray that they would keep their eyes on you, that no matter what happens, they would continue to trust you and be a testimony to a world. Lord, I feel right now more than many other times that the contrast between a saved person and a lost person should be so strong right now. And Lord, I pray that that would be the case, that the world would just see something different, something desirable in us, that we would be walking on higher ground, and that we would be doing so by faith, and it'd be evident to those that are around us. Lord, I pray that you would help us tonight to be changed by your Holy Spirit and your word, that you would show us the next step you want us to take in our walk with you, the step closer to you. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Let's all stand and get our hymnals again and turn to page 296. Or look on the board here. No, not one. Hymn number 296. There's not a friend like the lowly Jesus. No, not one. No, not one. None else can heal all our soul diseases. No, not one. No, not one. Jesus knows all about our struggles. He will guide till the day is done. There's not a friend like the lowly Jesus. No, not one. No, not one. No friend like him, it's so high and holy. No, not one. No, not one. And yet no friend is so meek and lowly. No, not one. No, not one. Jesus knows all about our struggles. He will guide till the day is done. There's not a friend like the lowly Jesus. No, not one. No, not one. Listen, there's not an hour that he is not near us. No, not one. No, not one. No night so dark, but his love can cheer us. That's right. Not one. No, not one. Jesus knows all about our struggles. He will guide till the day is done. There's not a friend like the lowly Jesus. No, not one. No, not one. Did ever saint find that friend forsake him? No, not one. No, not one. Or sinner find that he would not take him? No, not one. No, not one. Jesus knows all about our struggles. He will guide till the day is done. There's not a friend like the lowly Jesus. No, not one. No, not one. Was there a gift like the Savior given? No, not one. No, not one. Will he refuse us a home in heaven? No, not one. No, not one. Jesus knows all about our struggles. He will guide till the day is done. There's not a friend like the lowly Jesus. No, not one.
song because, man, if you were paying attention, they must have done something for you. They did something for me. That's oh, wow. There's not a one like Jesus. Not a single one. Praise God for Jesus. Esther chapter 4. Esther chapter 4. I was talking with Rob before the service. He said a shorter chapter tonight, 17 verses. Oh. I guess is a relative term, I suppose, but that's quite a lot of ground to cover. And I'll try to do it in less time than I did on Sunday morning. Oh, you know, sometimes I looked back and I was looking at the live stream, not watching through it, but I just saw the time amount. And I looked at it and I went, oh, ouch. Wow. We'll try to address that. Oh. Esther chapter 4. I want to begin tonight by starting with a question. And I want you to really seriously consider the answer in your own mind, because it's a question that it's so easy to very quickly answer it and just kind of move on. But I don't want you to do that. Just take a moment and think about it. The question is this. Would you rather be used by God or left in your comfort zone? Would you rather be used by God or left in your comfort zone? That's not the easiest question. If you take even just a couple moments to think about that, that's not an easy question to answer. But I feel safe in assuming, for those of us that are out at church on a Wednesday night, I would hope that even after taking a few seconds to think about that everybody who's seated here would answer that question and say, well, I want to be used by God. I want to be used by God. If it's between my comfort or being used by God, my comfort can take a break, and I want to be used by God. I hope that's your perspective tonight, because you can be. That is the truth. You can't. There's not a person, there's not a believer that can't be used greatly by God, because if you read through the Bible with your eyes open, what you see is a whole bunch of ordinary people. People that you can relate to. People that made mistakes. People you look at that and you say, well, I haven't made that mistake. And yet, you see people, these ordinary people that did just extraordinary things for God. Used in amazing ways. And I hope when looking at that, there's something in you. If you're a believer, something in you says, I want that. I want that. I want to be used in that way. And you might ask, so how? How can I be used that way? And I would ask the question, what is the difference? What's the difference between a believer that you see used greatly by God and a believer that just, for all intents and purposes, kind of sits on the shelf? What is the difference between those two individuals? In the book of Esther, there are two individuals that were used just in a phenomenal way by God. And you know who they are, this Mordecai and Esther. You couldn't overstate how much God used these two individuals for His people. And there are some important lessons that we can learn from them, especially out of this chapter in particular tonight. And that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to take a few moments and we're going to go over what's happening, and then I want to look at just two, I call them essentials. Essentials, if you want to be used by God, essential elements that we find in both Mordecai and Esther, that if you want to be used by God, they have to be there. They can't be replaced by anything else. Let's start reading Esther chapter 4. I'm going to read the first 3 verses just to get us started tonight. It says, when Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and cried with a loud and a bitter cry, and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting, and weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. If you're familiar with the story of Esther, or you were here last week, you know what's just happened. A decree has gone out, crafted by Haman, the enemy of the Jews, a descendant of King Agag, an Amalekite, somebody who wants to destroy the Jews at all costs. And the decree, sealed with the king's seal, has gone out, saying that every single Jew will be killed within a year's time on a particular date. Doesn't matter how young, doesn't matter how old, they're all going to be killed. And we see that this has a dramatic effect on Mordecai. And you say, how so? There is a massive shift in him as a person at the beginning of chapter 4. And I want you to see that. From what we can tell, Mordecai lived, up until this point, Mordecai lived a secular life. Secular life. And you say, well, how do you know that? Well, first of all, he kept his nationality a secret. His co-workers didn't know that he was a Jew until after they pressed on him and pressed on him and pressed on him. He finally broke down and told them, I'm a Jew. Okay, so they didn't know that. The people who came and took Esther away certainly didn't know that Mordecai was a Jew or that Esther was a Jew. The only way that could be secret is if they lived, from all outward appearances, a secular life. Because think about it, the law of Moses was designed to make the Jews peculiar. I mean, immediately recognizable. That person's different. That person's not like, that person's a Jew. I know the way they dress. I know their customs. And so, being in Persia, in Shushan, if you observed the Sabbath, wore clothes that didn't have mixed threads, only ate clean food, I mean, you would stick out like a sore thumb. I mean, it would be immediately evident, especially to people that you're around all the time. I mean, think about it. Mordecai's co-workers, they certainly would have known if Mordecai had lived according to the law as a Jew. But he must not have. He must not have, because it would have been so evident. So he lived pretty much a secular life, and that's the way he wanted it. Until chapter 4. There's a massive shift that happens here. Once Mordecai learned what had happened, he began to publicly mourn. Now, public mourning is something that seems very odd to us, because in our culture, if somebody passes away, grieving is considered to be a private matter, isn't it? I mean, in our culture, if somebody's going through something, we say, well, they probably need some space. They need some time to be left alone. That is the exact opposite in Jewish culture. When somebody passed away in Jewish culture, they had 7 official days of mourning. We're talking about weeping, wailing. We're talking about they would hire professional mourners whose purpose was to lament the individual that had died. It says even a poor man in Israel, when a loved one passed away, would have at least 2 women, professional mourners, and somebody to play an instrument. Okay, so if that's the poorest of the poor, you can imagine what this was like. It was an extremely public thing. And so when somebody died, they would make a cut in their garment, and they would rend it open a small distance, and they would put on a very dark or black colored clothing called sackcloth. Very rough, very, very, very coarse to the touch. They would put that on, and then they would sit in the dirt, the dust, and they would cast it up into the air. And they would be covered in dirt and dust, and it would come down upon them. They'd throw it up so it would come down and cover them. You can see how if you were walking through downtown Charlotte and you saw somebody seated in a pile of dirt wearing this really rough clothing with a group of people screaming and wailing around them, and they're throwing dirt into the air, and they're covered in, there's spit coming out of their mouth, there's dirt covering them. I mean, that's not, you can't ignore that, right? So Mordecai, the person who's lived a secular life up until this point, is all of a sudden out in Shushan, publicly mourning, as a Jew would do. Sackcloth and ashes, throwing dirt up, covered in dirt. You can see there's been a significant change in his life. I want you to notice where he goes. Where does he go? Look at the beginning of verse 2. It says, "And came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth," which gives you a clue. He didn't intend to stay outside the gate, but he wasn't allowed in, right? And this makes sense because in the Persian culture, it was customary to bring your grievances before the king. That was what a person did. This is what he's doing, but there's something very different about his grievance. Who is it against? It's against the king. Really, I mean, it's his sheet of paper that's posted everywhere saying the Jews are going to die. So let's get a handle on this, okay? So for lack of a better term, Mordecai is in front of the king's house protesting, covered in dirt, weeping, wailing, opposing the thing the king just sent out with his seal on it. Now we know Haman's pretty much the mastermind of this whole thing, but what is this going to look like? Is this a safe position to be in? There's no checks and balances in this society. There's no, the king wants to, but he's bound by the rules and a constitution and these other things. No. There's none of that. This is a dangerous position for him to be in. This is why it makes sense later in the chapter when Mordecai is advising Esther to risk her life. Get the correct perspective on that. He's asking her to do something he's already doing. Okay? He is really fully trusting God in the position he's in. Complete open honesty. I'm a Jew. These are my people that are going to be killed. It's not right. And I am mourning and I am beseeching the king about this matter. Big change in Mordecai's life. So we don't know if the king noticed. We don't know about that, but Esther certainly did. There are people that came to Esther and told her, Mordecai is out in front of the king's gate in sackcloth and ashes, weeping and wailing. Look what it says. Let's read verses 4 down to verse 6. It says, "So Esther's maids and her chamberlains came and told it her. Then was the queen exceedingly grieved, and she sent raiment to clothe Mordecai and to take away his sackcloth from him. But he received it not. Then called Esther for Hatach, one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had appointed to attend upon her, and gave him a commandment to Mordecai to know what it was and why it was. So Hatach went forth to Mordecai unto the street of the city, which was before the king's gate." So when Esther hears about what's going on, she's made aware that Mordecai is doing this. it says something here. Did you notice it? It says she is exceedingly grieved. At this point, so what is she so grieved about? At this point, she doesn't know about the decree. She doesn't know that all of the Jews have been ordered to be killed at this point. She's not grieving about that because she hasn't been made aware yet. She's grieving about the danger Mordecai's in. Remember who raised Esther? Mordecai is, for all intents and purposes, her father. This shows us how dangerous the situation was that Mordecai was in. Because this word is typically used to describe a woman that is writhing in pain as she gives birth. And when it doesn't refer to physical pain of that level, or physical pain, it refers to a similar level of mental pain or anguish. That's hard to equate in our minds, right? A physical pain so incredibly bad, and this is the mental equivalent. And I was trying to think of a good word in English that describes that, and it's hard. The word I came up with is agony. Agony. She is in agony over this because she knows the danger he's in. She knows that if this doesn't end soon, Mordecai's life probably will. That's the situation that he is facing. So what does she do? She sends clothes. She tries to stop it. She says, she hears about it. She says, get some clothes right now and take them down to Mordecai. Get some clothes on him. Get him off the street. She's trying to save his life, really. But he refuses. He refuses. He doesn't take the clothes that she offered. So finally, she sent a man down by the name of Hatak, basically to ask him, if I was going to say it in our words, what in the world are you doing? What is going on? Because she doesn't know at this point the decree or anything. She just knows that her father is doing something that's probably going to get him killed. And she doesn't know why. Look down at verses 7 through 9. It says, and Mordecai told him, that's talking about Hatak, Mordecai told him of all that had happened unto him, and of the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy them. Also, he gave him a copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and to declare unto her, and to charge her that she should go in unto the king to make supplication unto him, and to make request before him for her people. And Hatak came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. So Esther doesn't know about this decree, and you can sense the urgency with Mordecai as he's talking to this guy. I mean, it starts off, he says, first of all, he says, show it to her. Just show it. The words just mean to cause to see. Show it to her. But then he says, do more than show it to her. It says, declare it. Means to place a matter high or conspicuous before a person. To impress the seriousness upon a person. So he's talking to Hatak, and he says, you need to take this sheet of paper, you need to show it to her, and then you need to make her understand what that actually means. Impress on her the seriousness of this situation. And finally, he says, charge her. Means command her. Keep in mind, Esther's the queen. I mean, he might be her father, but she's the queen, and he's saying, you tell her to do this. There's urgency in what he's saying. Look down at verse 11 and 12. Let's start in verse 10 to 12. It says, again Esther spake unto Hatak and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. And this is what it said. It said, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come into the king into the inner court who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai Esther's words. So, Mordecai, he says, show it to her. He says, declare it to her. And then he says, charge her to do something. And so then Esther responds with this. And she tells him about this law. But notice what she said about the law. She said, everybody knows about this law. Right? Isn't that what she said? Said, and the people of the king's provinces do know. Everybody knows. So, why is she saying it then? Because if everybody knows about it, then Mordecai knows about it, right? I mean, he's a government official. If the people in India know about this, he knows about it. And so there's a lot of people that say that Esther had kind of come into her own, and she was kind of being condescending to Mordecai. Everybody knows. But I don't think so. Because think about this through the lens of real life. Okay? Everything that Esther has learned up to this point has pointed to the fact that Mordecai is not thinking clearly from her perspective, is beside himself, is doing something that no sane person would do. So it makes sense. She's not disrespecting Mordecai. She has great respect for Mordecai. She's making sure he knows what he's asking of her. She's reminding him because of the state he's in. I mean, this guy's sitting before the king's gate throwing dirt up into the air. Maybe he needs a reminder of how this works. And so she tells him what's going on, not disrespectfully, but just simply she's clarifying what's going on. But she includes another detail. She says she is currently out of favor with the king. Right? Isn't that what she says? At the end, he says, at the end of verse 11, but I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. She hadn't seen the king in a month. And more than likely, Mordecai doesn't know that. Doesn't seem like they have really hardly any communication at all, regularly. And so she says, not only is there this law that I'm reminding you of, but you might not know this, I'm out of favor with the king. I can't just... It's been 5 years since Esther was married to the king, a guy that has a harem full of hundreds of women. Okay, she's not in favor currently for whatever reason. So, that's the situation. Look down at what Mordecai responds, 13 and 14. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? That's probably the most famous words out of the book of Esther. And on the surface, it almost seems like Mordecai's threatening her, doesn't it? I mean, nobody knows that she's a Jew, right? So if they're going to find out, who are they going to find out from? It almost seems like maybe Mordecai, and that's kind of what it seems like on the surface, like he's saying, "Oh yeah, well I'll tell them who you are." That's not what's going on. Mordecai has learned from his history. That's what's going on. Mordecai has learned from his history. Who is Mordecai the ancestor of? We've talked about this extensively before. Who specifically, the most famous of his ancestors? King Saul. Okay? That's important. Because this isn't the first time that the Jews have been threatened by someone who wanted to destroy them. A very similar situation happened with King Saul in his second year as king. So he is king in his second year. The Philistines gathered together to destroy the Jews. It says that they were as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. Meaning, their army is so large, you just couldn't count it. It looks like grains of sand on the sea, on the shore, the beach. So that's what they're facing. Do you see the parallels there? I mean, an extinction level event. And so Saul is waiting for Samuel. You remember the story. Samuel is the prophet. Samuel's the one who's supposed to offer the sacrifice, and he's waiting, and he's waiting. He waits 7 days. 7 days for Samuel to show up. Doesn't show up, and what does he do? He offers the sacrifice himself, right? Do you remember what Samuel, we know that he shows up almost immediately after that happens. That's probably not a mistake. That's probably not an accident. But do you remember what Samuel said to Saul? It's very important. He said this, "Thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee." But watch what he says here. This is significant. He says, "For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee." Okay, do you understand what Samuel said there? He told Saul, he said, if you would have done what God said, if you would have done the right thing, God would have established you and your legacy, your kingdom forever. Meaning, if Saul would have done that, our Bibles wouldn't say the son of David, the root of Jesse. They would say the son of Saul, the root of Saul, of Kish. It would say something different. It would be entirely different. Our whole Bible, the whole everything. Saul had an opportunity. He was at the kingdom for such a time as that. And he had an opportunity. He could step forward and be used by God. But he didn't. And his house, his legacy was destroyed, done away with. And the entire history after that was completely rewritten. It wasn't that the Jews weren't going to be spared. That was God's will. God was going to take care of the Jews no matter what. It was just, who was he going to use to do it? Was he going to use Saul? No, he used somebody else. He used David. Okay, do you think Mordecai was familiar with that? Yes. Let's read verse 14 again. "For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" History is repeating itself. It's a second chance. It's an opportunity. See, Saul blew it. He had that opportunity. He could have stepped forward. The whole story could have been different. That's why Mordecai has such confidence about what he's saying. He knows what's going to happen because he's learned from his history. This has happened before. And he says, if you do what Saul did, you will have the same result that Saul had. Your father's house, it'll be destroyed. Yeah, God will save the Jews, but you'll have lost your opportunity, just like Saul did. That's what he's saying. He's not threatening her. He's just speaking the truth to her. Look down at verse 15 to 17. It says, "Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me. And neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise. And so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. Wow. She did what Saul didn't do. She stepped forward. She said, if God's going to use somebody, it might as well be me. I'm going to be used. I'm going to be the one that God uses in this scenario because He's put me in this place. He's prepared me for this. And I will be used. I will do what God wants me. I'll take that step. She was used in an incredible way by God. We know that. We're going to keep learning about that. But the question I have is this. Now that we kind of know what happens in chapter 4, can we be like Esther and Mordecai? We saw these two individuals used by God just, wow, in an incredible way. Okay, what about us? Can I be used of God like they were? And here's what it comes down to, these essential elements. You have to have these if you want to be used by God. There's just no two ways around it. These aren't peripheral things. These are things that are absolutely necessary. If Esther and Mordecai didn't have these two, they would not have been used by God. The first is this, the first essential element. You must trust Him. You must trust Him. And you're sitting there thinking, oh man, I thought it was going to be something a little more flashy than that. I thought, oh, just trust Him? Wow, that's not revolutionary. But it is. Really it is. Look what Mordecai said in verse 14. He said, basically he says, if you don't do it, Esther, he says, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. What is that? That is trust in God. That is Mordecai saying, God made promises to us, and He will fulfill them. We're not going to be exterminated. We're not going to be wiped off the face of the earth, and I know that for a fact. I trust Him. As dark as it is, as bad as it is, I have no doubts. That's what Mordecai said. I've got no doubts. God will save the Jews. No question about it in his mind. See, Mordecai trusted God, and God used him. God used him. God can use people like that. A couple weeks ago, actually almost exactly 2 weeks ago, I was listening to a message on the radio by Charles Stanley. And he was talking about his younger years when he was in seminary. He was almost finished up with, he had one more year to go, but he wasn't quite finished with the year. And he was planning that summer to go and work at a camp all the way in California. And so that's kind of what he'd planned for him and his wife to go and do. And he woke up one, I believe it was a Saturday morning, he woke up and he said he just was restless. He just felt just this incredible sense of just restlessness. And he knew that God was getting his attention. He knew God was doing something. And so he spent many hours praying. He said, I just need to get with the Lord and find out what this is because it's something. And as he was praying about it, he felt like God didn't want them to go and work at that camp in California, but that He wanted them to take the summer off. His family had I believe it was his family had a cabin up in the mountains, and he thought God wanted them to take the summer off and go up to that cabin. Now let me ask you, does that make any sense at all on a human level? You know, a seminary student, almost last year of school, and he's preparing for ministry, you know, trying to get ready as best he can, and God says, I want you to take the summer off. You're like, what? What will people think about me, you know? But you see that conflict? Do you trust me? Do you trust me? And so Charles Stanley, he made the decision. He said, okay, all right, it doesn't make any sense to me, but we'll do that. We'll take the summer off. We'll go up to the cabin. And so that's what he did. And after they'd been up there for, I think it was just a couple weeks, there was a little mountain church that I'm not sure if he had visited or they found out he was there or whatnot, but I mean, at that point, he's just a seminary student. He's not famous or anything. And so they asked him if he would preach. They were in between preachers. They asked him if he would preach that Sunday. Of course, he said, yeah, of course. Sure, I mean, I'd love to. So he preached for them that Sunday, and they said, hey, what about next Sunday? You think you can preach for us next Sunday? He preached for them again. They said, what about next Sunday? You think you can preach for us next Sunday? To make a long story short, that was Charles Stanley's first church. And it was from there that God guided him on the path that led him to be a help in my life. A kid from Montana, and people all over the world. I mean, whatever you think about Charles Stanley, you would have to admit God has used that man in a great way. Right? Okay, what if he wouldn't have trusted God? What if he would have made the logical choice? What if he made the choice that would have made more sense to his friends and his family? Would he still have been used in the same way that he has been? I don't think so. I don't think so. I seriously doubt it. Because, see, fear would have kept him from making the right decisions, not just then, but all the way down the line. That roadblock that he would have kept running into, that he doesn't trust God. But he did. And God used him in an incredible way and still is. See, many of us want to be used by God. I would hope to say that all of us want to be used by God. But many of us don't fully trust him. It's one of the simplest things in Christianity, but it is far from the easiest. Many of us don't fully trust him. Now, we trust him about certain things. We trust him for our salvation and for other things, to keep us safe on the roads or whatnot. But there are things, there might be things in your life where you don't trust God about that. You have those things. If God asks you to, there's a list, I wouldn't do that. And you know, if you know if you have a list like that, the things you won't do for God, what does that come down to? Not fully trusting him. Because if you did fully trust him, he could ask you to do anything, and you would do it. That makes it very difficult for you to be used of God, and for me when I'm in that state. If I don't fully trust him, it is very difficult to be used by him. It's like trying to do something with one hand tied behind your back. It doesn't work very well. Because if you don't fully trust him, you won't follow him consistently. There will be sometimes you'll obey him when it doesn't require that much trust, when it's a simple thing that just is not that hard. There's not a whole lot of uncertainty. But what about those other times when it takes a lot of trust? When it takes stepping out into the dark, only holding the hand of God, not knowing where your foot's going to land? Well, in those situations, you hold back. Say, I can't do that. I'm not ready. Shelf. Opportunity to be used, shelf. Trusting God is very important. Fully trusting him is incredibly important. Both Esther and Mordecai, they set aside their fear and trusted in God. Will you? Will you? I guarantee there's things you're afraid of. But will you trust God when you're afraid? Will you trust God enough to step out when it means he's all you've got and you're just trusting him? Will you do that? If you won't, then being used by God is not really an option. Not like Esther and Mordecai. I'm not saying God can't work things out in your life, but I'm saying being used like they were, not going to happen. Because this is essential. An essential element. There's a second one I want to look at briefly, and it's that you must value his plan more than your own. You must value his plan more than your own. Look what Esther says at the end of verse 16. Famous words, the very end. And if I perish, I perish. I am certain that this is not the plan Esther would have chosen. I guarantee it. This is not her plan. Now she's doing it, but it's God's plan. So she came to the fork in the road, the proverbial fork in the road, where she had to make a decision where she said, that's not the plan I'd choose. I wouldn't do that. I'd do something else. And God's plan is this: facing death, full of uncertainty about what's going to happen. And she had to make that choice. She had to make that choice between, what am I going to do? It's a question of value, right? Which is more important to me? My plan or his plan? My comfort or what he wants me to do? My goals or his goals? Which is more important to her? And you can see what was more important because of the choice she made. His plan was more important than hers. Hers didn't include risking her life, but God's did, and she said, okay. And if I perish, I perish. Even if that plan includes dying, it's still more important than mine. I'll still do it if it means that. Could you do that? Could you make that choice? Could you say that? We've all made similar decisions, not with such a great magnitude maybe. Maybe some of you have made decisions of that magnitude before. But we've all made similar decisions where there's times in our life where God's will and our will align. And those are the easy points, right? Those are the fun times. That's the good times. But what happens when God's will and your will diverge? Now that's when it gets hard. Because you have to make the choice. Which is more important to me? Is it God's will or my will? Is it his plan or my plan? Which is more important to me? See, this is why so many Christians sit on the shelf. Because they don't have this. They don't have this element. They have their plan, and it is more important than God's plan in their eyes. So when they come to that fork in the road, they go down the path that leads straight to the shelf instead of the path that leads to being used by God, because they don't have this. In 2 Timothy 2:21, God said that we should be, he said, a vessel unto honor, sanctified and meet for the master's use, and prepared unto every good work. In other words, we should be a tool that God can use at any moment. A tool in his toolbox. He pops it open, he's got something he's doing, and there is Eric Flanagan, Pastor Wheeler, Don Owens, Caleb Wheeler. There's that tool, and that's the one he's going to use. Imagine, though, if a tool only worked 20% of the time. Maybe 50% of the time. Maybe 75% of the time. But that other percentage, it had a mind of its own. You just could not make it do what you needed it to do. Okay, what happens to that? What happens to that tool? What happens to that tool? You either replace it or you put it on the shelf. The only reason you'd use a tool like that is if you had no other options, right? Sometimes we have to use something like that. You're like, I don't have anything else. You know, this screw has to go in, and I've got a penny, so here we go. But you don't normally do that. But this is important. God never runs out of options. God is never going to use you because he has nobody else. That means if the tool doesn't work, it gets put on the shelf because there are other options. If you won't be used by God, if you won't witness to that person, God can use somebody else. You and I, we are not indispensable to him. He can use his will. See, the thing with the Jews here, they're going to get saved. He has a promise to keep, and he will keep it. But it's whether Esther is going to get used or not. It's whether Mordecai is going to get used or not. If they don't get used, fine, God will use somebody else. But they needed to be a tool that would fit the job, that would work, that wouldn't have a mind of their own to refuse the work that was trying to be done through it. When I look at Esther chapter 4, I see two ordinary people. Really, I see two ordinary people that did extraordinary things for God. Truly extraordinary. There was no magic ingredient. There was no special spiritual dust that they used. There was no magic prayer. They simply trusted in God and valued His plan more than their own. It wasn't more complicated than that. And you know what that says to me? There's hope for me. Because if there's some magic ingredient, I don't have it. But if it's trusting God and valuing His plan more than my own, that is attainable. That is something I can do. Listen to what I'm going to say, and then I'll be done. Usability is not determined by God. It is determined by you. Usability isn't determined by God. It is determined by you. So I want to ask just one final question, and I want you to think about it. Are you usable? Are you? Am I? Let's pray. Dear God, we love you.